All right, Clockwork Part 3, the final part, final chapter. Chapter part. Okay, Sir Ironsoul stopped at once with a whir and a click. His sword was inches from Gretel's throat. The prince's song ran out sweetly through the parlor. Gretel could only stare in horror at Sir Ironsoul and his sword, and at the wonder at the prince. Hey, where'd you come from? She said. Are you the little prince in that story? I think you must be. But how cold you are! And who is this? Ah, how sharp is that sword? I don't like him at all. Oh, what am I going to do? I feel I'm supposed to do something, but I don't know what it is. There was no one around to help. She was alone with the two little figures, one all malice and the other all sweetness. Gretel touched the prince's cheek gently and found it cold, but her touch awoke something in his machinery for an instant, and he turned his eyes towards her and smiled. "Oh, you poor thing," she cried. He opened his lips and sang out one or two notes. "I know what it is," said Gretel. "You're not well, and I don't like that little knight one bit, but I don't want to leave you here with him. But I know whose fault this is. It's Fritz's fault. He's the one who made up that story. If only we could find out how the story finished." She looked at the stove, where Fritz had thrown the sheets of paper on which the story was written. She had thought they were all destroyed, but crumpled up on the floor in the shadow, there was one piece left unburned. She picked it up and straightened it out, and it was the very page she'd been reading when the stranger, Dr. Calminius, had come in. On it were the words, "He was very tall and thin, with a prominent nose and jaw. His eyes blazed like the coals in the caverns of darkness, and his hair was long and gray, and he wore a black cloak with a loose hood, that of a monk. He had a harsh, grating voice, and his expression was full of savage curiosity, and that was the man who—" And that was it. There was no more. The story just stopped at that point. "That's exactly when he came in," said Gretel to herself. But there were another few words scribbled below, and peering closely, she managed to make them out. "Oh, this is impossible. How can I write an ending to this story? I'll just have to make it up when I get there, and I hope that I do it well. And if I come up with something good, the devil can have my soul." That's not good. Gretel's eyes widened. She bit her lip in horror. People should not say things like that. "Well," she said to herself, "he started it all off, and I'm going to make him finish it. You sit here and keep warm, Prince Florian, if that's who you really are, and I'll go and fetch Fritz. He's the one who can sort this all out." So she threw on her cloak and set off to the house where Fritz, the storyteller, had his lodging. Meanwhile, Karl had been preparing the place for the mechanism of the great clock that was set aside for his masterpiece. Feverish with excitement, he hurried down the staircase of the clock tower, across to the square and the inn. The old cat Pootsie had come outside with Gretel, but he didn't like the cold, and he sat on the windowsill, cleaning his ears, wondering if this man would let him in again for a snooze by the stove. But Karl did not notice. He had other things than cats on his mind. He went in quietly and shut the door. Then he stopped in alarm, for there was the canvas thrown aside, and there was Sir Ironsoul, sword upraised, on the other side of the room. Karl's heart missed a beat. Had someone else come in and disturbed the little knight? There was no one dead, at least by the way the figure had moved. Karl looked around, but then he saw the little prince sitting there politely in his chair, just watching him, and 1,000 strange fears ran over his skin. Karl opened his mouth to speak and then realized that the child wasn't alive after all. It was another clockwork figure like Sir Ironsoul, and a far finer one by the look of it. He peered at it closely. The hair, the finest gold wires had ever seen. Bloom of the silver cheeks like a butterfly's wing, and the eyes bright blue jewels, almost alive in the way they seemed to look at him. Only Dr. Calminius could have created this, and he must have brought it for Karl. What did the figure do? Karl reached out and lifted the prince's hand from his lap. With a little flicker of his energy, Prince Florian shook Karl's hand and sang a bar of music for him. Karl's hair stood on end for an idea that had just come to him. Why not put this figure in the clock instead of Sir Ironsoul? It was more finely finished, and a handsome little boy who sang a pretty tune would be far more popular with the crowds than a faceless knight who did nothing but threaten people with a sword. And then he could keep Sir Ironsoul for himself. And then how his mind raced. He could travel the world. He had become famous, giving exhibitions and demonstrations. He became quite dizzy as the thought of the uses to which he could put the metal knight too. The gold he could steal, the forbidden treasures that he could be his, and if he had a secret accomplice like Sir Ironsoul, he could be relied on always to kill and never give him away. All he would have to do was to trick his intended victim into saying the word devil, and leave Sir Ironsoul nearby to play his part. He, Carl, could be somewhere else entirely, playing cards with a dozen witnesses, or even in a church surrounded by the faithful. No one would ever know. Sorry, I'm thirsty. So excited did he become that he lost all sense of what was right. The church, his father, his mother, his brother, his sister, Herr Ringelmann, every influence for good he'd ever known was whirled into darkness, and all he could see was wealth and power that could be his if he used Sir Ironsoul in this way. Before he could change his mind, he threw the canvas over the night, tucked the stiffening figure of Prince Florian under his arm, and set off back to the clock tower. Meanwhile, Gretel was struggling through the snow towards the house where Fritz was lodged. She could see from the end of the street that all the windows were dark except one in the attic, where Fritz often used to work throughout the night. She had to knock a half-dozen times before the landlady came grumbling up to the door. Who is it? What do you want this time of night? Oh, it's you, child. What in the world are you after? I have to speak to Herr Fritz. It's very important. Mumbling and frowning, the old lady stepped aside and said, Yeah, I heard about that business at the inn. Making up wicked stories, frightening people. I'll be glad when he's gone. In fact, I've got a half a mind to give him his notice right now. Now you can go on up, child. Top of the stairs and keep going. And no, you can't have this candle. This is the only one I've got, and I need it myself. You've got sharp eyes. Make do. So Gretel climbed the 4 flights of stairs to the top of the house, each one darker and narrower than the one below, and at last came to a tiny landing where a line of light glowed beneath a door. There she knocked, and a nervous voice answered. Who is it? What do you want? It's Gretel, Mr. Fritz, from the inn. I gotta speak to you. Come on in then, as long as you're by yourself. Gretel opened the door, and she found Fritz standing in the light of the smoky lamp, throwing paper after paper into a leather bag that was bulging with clothes and books and other bits and pieces. A glass of plum brandy stood on the table beside him. He had already drunk quite a lot by the look of him, for his eyes were wide and his cheeks were flushed, and his hair was standing on end. What is it? He said. What do you want? That story you told us, Gretel began. But she got no further, for the young man put his hands over his ears and shook his head violently. Don't speak of it. I wish I'd never begun it. I wish I'd never told a story in my life. But you've got to listen to me, she said. Something dreadful's going to happen. I don't know what it is because you didn't finish that story. How do you know I didn't finish it? He said. She showed him the sheet of paper she'd found. He groaned and put his face in his hands. Hey, groaning's not going to help, she said. You've got to finish that story properly. What happens next? I don't know, he cried. I dreamed the first part of it, and it was so strange and horrible that I couldn't resist writing it down and pretending it was mine, but I couldn't think of any more. But what are you going to do when you got to that part? She said. I don't know, make it up, he said. I've done that before. I often do it. I enjoy the risk, you see. I start telling a story with no idea of what's going to happen at the end, and I make it up when I get there. Sometimes it's even better than writing it down first. I was sure I could do it with this one, but when the door opened and the old man came in, I must have panicked. I wish I'd never begun. I will never tell another story again. You must tell the end of this story, though, said Gretel, or something bad's going to happen. You have to. I can't. You must. I couldn't. You have to. Impossible, he said. I cannot control it anymore. I wound it up and set it going, and it'll just have to work itself out. I wash my hands of it, and I'm off. But you can't. Where are you going? Anywhere. Berlin, Vienna, Prague, as far away as I can get. Then he poured himself some more plum brandy and swallowed it all in one go. Alcohol's bad for you, remember that. So Gretel sighed and turned to leave. At the same time as she was feeling her way down the dark stairs in Fritz's lodging house, Carl was heading back to the inn. He had taken little Prince Florian up to the clock tower and fastened him to the frame, ignoring the prince's helpless struggles and his musical requests for mercy. When the morning came, there would be Carl's masterpiece, on a show as everyone expected. Carl would receive everyone's congratulations and his certificate of competence from Mr. Ringelmann, and he'd enter in the role of Master Clockwork Makers. There, he could leave town and make his way with Sir Ironsoul into the wide world, where power and fortune awaited him. But when he opened the door of the inn to collect the little knight and hide him with his lodgings, he felt a shiver of fear. He stood on the threshold, afraid and unwilling to enter. Once again he took no notice of Pootsy the cat, who jumped down from the windowsill when he saw the door open. Well, you see, there's no need to be superstitious about cats, but they are our fellow creatures, and we shouldn't ignore them. It probably would have been polite for Carl to maybe offer his knuckles to the old cat and rub his head against it, but Carl was so wound up tightly for politeness, so he didn't see the cat stalking in the past his legs. Finally, Carl gathered his courage and went in, and how still the room was, and how sinister that figure under the canvas, and that sword point how wickedly sharp, sharp enough to have pierced the canvas already and be glinting in the lamplight. Some coals had settled in the stove, sending a little flare of red out on the floor, making Carl jump nervously. The glow made him look and think of the fires of hell, and he sweated and mopped his brow. Then the long case clock in the corner began to whir and wheeze and preparing to strike. Carl leapt as if he'd been discovered in the act of murder, and leaned weakly against the table, his heart beating like thunder. "I can't bear this," he said. "I've done nothing wrong, haven't I? Then why am I so nervous? What is there to be frightened of?" Hearing his words, old Pootsie decided here was someone who might give him a little milk, if he asked nicely. So the cat jumped up on the table and beside him and rubbed himself on Carl's arm. Feeling this, Carl turned in shock to see a black cat, who had appeared, as it seemed, out of nowhere. Naturally, this was too much for Carl. He leapt away from the table with an exclamation of horror. "Ah, what the devil!" And then he clapped his hands to his mouth, as if trying to cram that word back inside. But it was too late. In the corner of the room, the metal figure began to move. The canvas fell to the floor, and Sir Ironsoul raised his sword even higher, and then turned his helmet this way and that, until he saw where Carl was cowering in the corner. "No, no, stop! Wait! The tune! Let me whistle the tune!" But his lips were too dry. Frantic, he licked them with his dry tongue. No use. He could not produce a sound. Nearer and nearer came the little knight, with a sharp sword, and Carl stumbled away, trying to hum, to sing, to whistle, and all he could do was cry and stammer and sob, and the knight came closer and closer. He killed him. He's dead. Okay, when Gretel got back to the inn, she heard Pootsie meowing inside. Seeing the word meowing spelt out is interesting. And as she opened the door, she said, "How did you get in here, you silly cat?" But Pootsie shot out into the square as Gretel came in and wouldn't be stopped to be petted. Gretel shut the door and looked around for the prince, but she did not see him anywhere. Instead, a horrid sight had met her eyes and made her shiver and clutch her breast. There, in the middle of the room, stood Sir Ironsoul with a blank helmet shining and the sword slanting downward. He was holding it like that because the point of it was in the throat of Carl the apprentice, who lay stark dead beside him. Gretel nearly fainted, but she was a brave little girl, and she had seen what had lay in Carl's hand. It was the heavy iron key of the clock tower. With her mind in a whirl, she was still able to guess part of what happened, if not all of it, and she realized what Carl must have done with the prince. So she took the key away from his hand and ran out of the inn, across the square to the great dark tower. She turned the key in the lock and began to climb for a second time that night, but these stairs were higher and steeper than those Fritz's lodging. They were darker too, and there were bats that flitted through the air, and the wind groaned across the mouths of the mighty bells and made their ropes swing dismally. But up and up she climbed until she came to the lowest of the clock chambers, where the oldest and simplest part of the mechanism was housed. In the darkness she felt her way around the huge iron cogwheels, the thick ropes, and the stiff metal figures of St. Wolfgang the devil, but she couldn't find the prince, so she climbed on. She ran her hands over the archangel Michael, and in his armor reminded her of Sir Ironsoul, and she took her hands quickly away. She felt up the side of the figure in a painted robe, and her fingers explored his face until she realized it was the skull face of death, and she took her hands away of that too. The higher she climbed, the more noise the clock made, ticking and talking and clicking and creaking and whirring and rumbling. She clambered over the struts and levers and chains and cogwheels, and farther she went, the more she felt as if she too was becoming part of that clock. All the time she peered into the darkness and felt around and listened with all her might. Finally, she clambered up through a trap door into the very topmost part of the chamber and found a silver moonlight shining in on such complexity of the mechanical parts that she could make no sense of them at all. At the same moment, though, she heard a little song. It was the prince calling to her. Dazzled by the moonlight, Gretel blinked and rubbed her eyes, and there was Prince Florian with the very last of his clockwork life singing like a nightingale. "Oh, you poor thing! He fastened you so tightly that I can't undo the bolts. That was wicked. He was going to leave you here and run away, I'm sure. What's the matter with you, Prince Florian? I'm sure you'd tell me if you could. I think you're ill. That's what the trouble is. I think you need some warming up. You're too cold." Sorry. But that's hardly surprising, seeing what they've done to you. Never mind. If I can't get you down, I'll stay up here with you. I can wrap my cloak around us and both, and you'll see. We're better off up here anyways. If you ask me, the things that have been going on, you'd never believe it. I won't tell you now because you wouldn't go to sleep. I'll tell you in the morning. I promise. You comfortable, Prince Florian? You don't have to speak if you don't want to. You can just nod. Prince Florian nodded, and Gretel tucked her cloak around them and helped the little boy in her arms and held the little boy in her arms as she went to sleep. The last thing she thought was, he's getting warmer. I'm sure of it. I can feel it. The morning came, and all through the town, visitors and townsfolk alike were getting dressed and eating their breakfast hungrily, eager to see the new figure in the famous clock. The snow-laden rooftops glittered and gleamed in the bright blue air, and the fragrance of roasting coffee and fresh-baked rolls drifted through the streets. And as time drew on toward 10 o'clock, a strange rumor went around the town. The clockmaker's apprentice had been found dead, murdered. What was more, the police called Mr. Ringelmann in to look at the body, and the old clockmaker was appalled to see his apprentice lying dead. The poor boy. It was his day of fame. Whatever could have happened? What a disaster. Who could have done this terrible thing? Do you recognize this figure? Mr. Ringelmann said to the sergeant. Sergeant, this is a Clockwork Knight? No, I've never seen it before in my life. Is that Karl's blood on its sword? I'm afraid so. Do you think he could have made this figure? Certainly not. The figure he made is up in the clock. That's a tradition, you know, Sergeant. He was going to fit his new figure in the clock on the last evening of his apprenticeship, just as I did in my time. Karl was a good boy, a little quiet and morose perhaps, but a good apprentice. I'm sure he did what he was supposed to. We'll see his new figure when it comes out in a minute or so. What a sad occasion, instead of a happy one. The new figure will have to be in his memorial, poor boy. Nothing was right that morning, though. The innkeeper was desperately anxious because Gretel was missing. Well, we know where Gretel is. What could have happened to her? The whole town was in a ferment. A crowd had gathered outside the inn, and they watched the policemen carrying out Karl's dead body on a stretcher, covered by a piece of canvas. But they didn't look that way for long because it was nearly 10 o'clock, and the time had come for a mechanism to reveal the new figure. All eyes turned upward. There was even more interest than usual because of the strange circumstances of Karl's death. And the square was so crowded that you couldn't see the couples. People were crammed shoulder to shoulder, and every face was turned upward to like a flower to the sun. The hour began to strike, and the ancient clock wheezed and whirred, and the mechanisms came out into play. The familiar figures came out first, and bowed or gestured, or simply twirled on their toes. There was St. Wolfgang, throwing the devil over his shoulder, and there was the Archangel Michael with his glittering armor. There was the figure Herr Ringelmann made for the end of his apprenticeship, many years ago. A little boy who popped out, thumbed at his nose at his death, and twiddled his fingers